Hello, everyone. How are you? Good? Yes, love to hear it. So my name is Maggie Love. I'm going to be giving an infrastructure talk titled Saving Web3 Protocols from the Fate of Web2 Companies. I'm super honored and excited to be on the ETHCC main stage today. I've been coming to ETHCC since 2018 when it was in one room. You'd listen to a talk and then walk to the common area and chat everyone up. So just incredible shout out to the organizers and everyone who's been a part of scaling ETHCC and making France a hub for the Ethereum and broader blockchain community. So let's get started. Just a bit about me, I'll be quick. I went to undergraduate at Northwestern University, and I started my career at IBM, and I actually did product strategy at IBM Watson for about 2.5 years before I heard about blockchain in a corporate strategy meeting and said, oh, I have to go do that right now. Found my way to Consensus in 2017, and then in 2018, I co-founded Web3 Cloud, and Web3 Cloud provides compute and storage infrastructure for blockchain protocols. We're a joint venture between Consensus, the Ethereum company, and Advanced Micro Devices, the chip company. So we've been around building infrastructure, working with protocols, helping them scale so they can focus on software for about 5 years now. Then in 2019, I saw the revolution that was going on in decentralized finance and decided I wanted more women and non-binary folks to be part of it. So I built SheFi, and that's turned into a 13-week course on all the top use cases, 1,700 members from 50+ countries. So you could say I spend all my time at different foundational levels of the ecosystem building it up. And really the goal of this talk, is convincing Web3 to make decentralized infrastructure a priority and a first-class metric, and to get you to start thinking about infrastructure providers as not just commodities where you go and rent compute, but actually figuring out who can be a partner with you to keep your infrastructure decentralized and scalable. And I'm going to take a bit of a different route. I'm not going to sit here right now and just say like, oh, Ethereum is centralized here and here and here, or here's where all these other networks are centralized. I'm going to take us through the lens of what's going on in the Web2 space and then bring us into what's going on in the Web3 space. How many people are familiar with this article? Software is Eating the World by Mark Andreessen. Good, a couple people. If you're not familiar, I would definitely go check it out. I guess then probably not many of you are familiar that 10 years later, his firm wrote an article called The Cost of the Cloud, a $1 trillion paradox. So 10 years prior, we're just talking about software, thinking about scaling there. And 10 years later, we have some challenges because of how much we focused on software and left compute to be outsourced. And there's no doubt that cloud is one of the most significant platform shifts in the history of computing. It helps cultivate innovation as company resources are freed up to focus on products and new growth. But I want you to put a number in your head. How much do you think of the market value is being lost across the top public software companies due to cloud impact on margins? Can you raise your hand if you think it's in the thousands across the top 50 public software companies? Raise your hand if you think it's in the millions. Raise your hand if you think it's in the billions. Okay, so we are aware of what's going on in the cloud space. So an estimated $100 billion of market value is being lost across the top 50 software public companies due to cloud impact on margins. So once again, this leads to what we are calling the cloud oligarchy, right? And part of the reason that Amazon, Google, Microsoft represent a combined $5 trillion market cap, and because they're all buffeted from market competition, and they have high profit margins driven in part by running their own infrastructure, enabling even greater reinvestment into product and talent while buoying their own share prices. Right, so cloud is an amazing step function in how we were able to build software. We no longer had to run our personal large computers in order to make the internet work. But at the same time, now we face this challenge of this cloud oligarchy who can drive huge profits and have great margins because they own all the infrastructure. And so I want to talk a bit more about the worldwide enterprise spending on cloud and data centers. IT spending on cloud is growing at a base of over $100 billion annually. And of course, at early stage, cloud drives efficiencies in operations and economics, so it's a wise choice for startups, and they can spend their capital elsewhere, building their team, building their product. But as companies mature and they get to the growth and late growth stage, the cost of cloud drives lower profit margins. And an estimated $8 billion in aggregate is spent on cloud for the top 50 publicly traded software companies. So this is what a big challenge that Web2 is facing today. And what Web2 is doing right now is something called cloud repatriation, which just means bringing your infrastructure in home. It's a challenge, it's expensive, and it's costly, but between moving it back in-house or to third-party solutions or building special purpose hardware, these companies can save billions of dollars. And so for these top 50 public software companies, repatriation drives a 50% reduction in cloud spend and a net savings of around $4 billion. And so moving infrastructure back on-premise drives 1/3 to 1/2 costs of running workloads in the cloud. And so what we can take away from Web2, the TLDR here, is that infrastructure spend should be a first-class metric that companies need to prioritize early, often, and outside of the cloud, which I think all of us here in Web3 would definitely agree with that. But I know of many Web3 companies spending quite a massive amount on their cloud infrastructure because they wanted to scale and then think about decentralization second. Now we're going to go into what Web3 kind of offers. But first, how many of you know DHH, the inventor of Ruby on Rails? He has a company, 37 Signals, and he's recently been being very public about his process of taking his company off the public cloud because they're spending over $3 million on cloud. So while you may have scaled and have all these customers and users, I think about 80% of revenues, somewhere around there, are actually going to cloud spend. And so, as I mentioned, we now are in the hands of 3 main clouds that we are very dependent on for our services, for our scaling, and it's very hard to move on from them. And so what are some of the problems that this cloud oligarchy drives? Cost. So we've spent a lot of time talking about cost already. Outages and downtime. You may have been aware of the AWS outage that US Virginia East, like one of the biggest data centers, went offline for 3 hours a couple weeks ago. Privacy and security. So we know that our data, we would prefer to be private and secure, and traditional cloud infrastructure does not really provide the right safety. And then there's a lot of challenges for these cloud providers with data sovereignty and regulatory issues. We're in the land of GDPR here. But most importantly, what we have from centralized cloud infrastructure and building on it is extreme vendor lock-in. It is very hard if you've built all of your infrastructure software APIs into AWS to have it ported to somewhere else. You have to basically start all over. So this extreme vendor lock-in has led to this cloud oligarchy. And if we look at the evolution of the cloud, we have Web2. We're aware the 3 main players. Yes, there are smaller bare metal providers and players out there as well. Then we have the hybrid cloud, right? These other big players who wanted to get into this space, but provide both on-prem and off-prem solutions. And then we have this idea of a Web3 cloud or a Web3 decentralized compute. And it was honestly started by the Bitcoin miners who are still out there today providing compute and storage for the Bitcoin network or compute. We have this idea around decentralized physical infrastructure, or DPIN, a growing class of protocols that are using the economic incentives of tokens to bootstrap physical networks. We have solo validators in many of the blockchain protocols, and of course we have node infrastructure providers. So this is like the ideal case of what Web3 looks like, right? Independent parties coming together, being bootstrapped by token economics to support infrastructure, moving us away from being dependent on some big cloud providers. And to take a step back, Bitcoin really pioneered this. Bitcoin invented this idea of a global distributed infrastructure network. Through proof of work, it proved that with the right incentives, one can coordinate capital, machines, and labor without a centralized entity. Right? Nobody was hired at the Bitcoin network to scale it to what it was today. the network itself distributed tokens in order to galvanize people, infrastructure providers, developers to all be a part of it. And so what was really exciting about Bitcoin and blockchain networks is that they offer this blank canvas for token distribution and crypto economics to facilitate coordination. We call blockchains coordination machines. And the ideal here is that you're able to really scale your network with the right incentives without too many humans behind it. And so what we hope with decentralized infrastructure is the right token rewards allow a network to bootstrap the supply side to a point where users find its services attractive to use. And we know that has been a bit of a challenge as well. And so you might have heard this, that Web3 is crypto's attempt to reinvent the internet, and it's an internet owned by the users and builders orchestrated with tokens. So if we look at Web2 to Web3, we're looking at shifting from an internet that is closed off and focused on platforms to one that is more open and decentralized, as it's made up of blockchain protocols run by a global community of participants, incentivized and coordinated through blockchain protocol tokens. And the defining feature of moving from Web2 to Web3 is this idea that we can distribute value through these networks. And it's why it's captured the hearts and minds in so many builders, as we are no longer just transferring bits across the internet, but bits attached with value. And the fact that we have this value to help bootstrap our networks and drive many coordinated activities has moved us really from a read-write internet to a read-write-own. And so if we look at the differences between Web2 and Web3, Web2 is centralized. There are a few large players. They have multi-trillion-dollar corporations. They can censor. They're expensive for developers. You really many times have to be invited into that company or ecosystem to build. And really the corporations retain all the value and can drive a lot of profit from those margins. What we imagine in Web3 and what we're all trying to build towards is a decentralized ecosystem, distributed and long tail, built of crypto incentivized protocols. Censorless, where developers can easily participate through open source, and it has native value distributed to all of the builders and participants, even the infrastructure providers. So Web2, we're familiar with a lot of these companies. If we're thinking about the cloud, it's Azure, Google, and AWS. And then in the Web3 bucket, we have a lot of different protocols at the infrastructure layer attempting to distribute and decentralize the internet and its infrastructure through tokens. And these are 4 buckets of where we as an infrastructure provider are really excited about seeing decentralized infrastructure come to life. So access and infrastructure, decentralized RPC protocols, how we actually read and write information from the blockchain, compute and infrastructure, so a lot of the layer 1s out there, as well as zero knowledge protocols, storage infrastructure, and staking infrastructure as well. So all of these different protocols can really harness many infrastructure providers and should be thinking about not just going straight to AWS or a cloud provider, but really how to get the incentives right over a long term to excite infrastructure providers, solo validators, node runners of all sizes to get involved. And so really, what is the value of decentralized infrastructure, especially across those 4 buckets? We talk a lot about credible neutrality in the blockchain space, building these networks that are credibly neutral. And in order to do that, we are going to need to not be dependent on a single cloud provider. Resilience is a key factor, right? As different geographies have different regulatory bodies and policies, we want our networks to withstand what one jurisdiction does. Performance. So we know that the performance of the overall network is enhanced, especially in Ethereum, if the nodes are not centralized on one cloud provider or entity, or Geth is not centralized, we have better performance of the network. Cost. So you can really drive your costs down and outsource your costs, right, by incentivizing infrastructure providers, rewarding them, really get away from those cloud costs that you have if you have the right incentives. And most importantly, there's going to be this concept of no vendor lock-in. So even today, if you are doing staking infrastructure, you sign up with a bare metal provider, let's say, maybe like OVH, you're likely going to be locked into a 3-month, 6-month, X-month contract. And even if you're not getting the best pricing there, if a new provider comes up, it's actually hard to move your stake from that provider to a new one. So what we want to see is infrastructure providers and technology that allows you to keep your tokens, keep your keys, and seamlessly move from one provider to another in a much more easy way without the costs. And then we have this idea of open compute marketplaces, as I mentioned. So different protocols, different applications can seamlessly move if there's an open market for decentralized compute and get the best costs and efficiency and performance advantages by not being locked into one cloud provider. And at the end of the day, that's offering all the protocols, all the participants in the ecosystem, greater freedom and control over how their network works, how their infrastructure is working. And then finally, agreements are code, right? We have this concept in the blockchain space where we're operating with math and algorithms, and they're becoming the way that we form agreements and outside of parties in the traditional legal system. So how do we invent protocols that also enforce the right types of agreements between multiple ecosystem participants in the infrastructure space? And so now that we know a bit, what's going on in the Web2 space, what's the ideal in the Web3 space from an infrastructure perspective, what are the types of participants, what are the types of use cases and protocols that would benefit from decentralized infrastructure, I just want to check in on the Ethereum ecosystem. You could probably apply this more broadly to other ecosystems as well, but what's kind of going on right now in terms of infrastructure in the space? So if we look at node distribution right now, and this was just pulled from ethernodes.org, about over 60% of Ethereum nodes are being hosted. And then if we break that down, Amazon.com has over 60% of the nodes on their hosting infrastructure. It's actually better than it was a few months ago. At ETH Denver, it was around 70%. But still, this definitely should raise some eyebrows, get people thinking about what that means. I'm not here to cause alarm or say Ethereum is centralized. I've done that on Twitter. It didn't go well. And so just being aware as somebody who might be participating in the node ecosystem, you should know where your stake is being located. And it is a bit of a concern that over 60% of nodes are on AWS. Because if we look at Web3 today, what does that mean for the cloud space? We have Bitcoin miners, we have DePIN networks, solo validators, node infrastructure providers, and we have AWS, Google, and Azure. And we're quite dependent on them. And so what's the reality for Ethereum? Why is this happening? Kevin Owocki tweeted, "My ETH staking setup makes $100 a month and costs are $1,000 a month to host on AWS. I'm going to move to home staking for cost decentralization reasons. Show me your setup, please." So not only is it a risk that more than half of the nodes are on these hosting providers, but also it's expensive as well. And you may not be aware of that. It's easy. You can go to AWS and click spin up a node today, and you may be thinking you're making a great return, but it's actually costing you a lot more. Another point of centralization in the infrastructure space, this has been talked a lot about recently, is Lido, right? So Lido is a liquid staking provider. It's really easy to stake any amount of ETH you want with them to participate in consensus and securing the network, but they have, I believe like 70% share of the Ethereum staked, which rings the alarm bells for many reasons. And just an example of what could happen, but what didn't happen, Amazon Web Services briefly hit by a wide-ranging outage impacting major websites. Evan Van Ness, he has it, he's like the Ethereum decentralization maxi in his profile. I don't know if that's a joke or not. But you put AWS is back, seems like an outage limited to US East, zero effect on Ethereum. I imagine if there was some effect if AWS went down in Europe, given how much Lido is in the cloud. Don't stake with pools who run in the cloud. And we'll talk about really what the consequences of that are next. In contrast, and this isn't picking on a different blockchain protocol, Phantom, was hit by the AWS outage and currently impacting our services. Your assets are safe, and we will keep you updated as things are resolved. And really the idea of decentralized infrastructure is that these outages don't happen, that you never try to log into your wallet and you can't see your assets and you can't get a hold of your assets, right? Self-sovereignty starts with always being able to access your assets. And so what are the risks of cloud infrastructure for Web3 if it's centralized? Continued dependency and growth of Web2 cloud providers in the space. Cost. It is very costly to be running all of your software on AWS. Outages, censorship, and interestingly enough, regulatory body claiming jurisdiction over a network. Whether we believe Gary or not, he tweeted one day that, most of Ethereum nodes were hosted in the United States, therefore he gets to regulate the Ethereum network. And then there can be an increased attack surface if something like a cloud provider goes down and it does impact the network, if nodes start being slashed. We'll have performance issues as well. As you know, if over 1/3 of nodes are hosted on a certain provider and they start to not be able to finalize for some reason, let's say there is an outage, their stake will be slashed until they're less than 1/3 of the network, so the network can go back to performing as it should. And so you might lose some assets, items, goodbye NFTs, especially if your NFTs are actually hosted on a cloud provider and not with IPFS or a decentralized storage option. And so how can we examine decentralization then? If we know the risks, how can we take this information and understand, how decentralized is a network? What could I be looking at? You can be looking at the hosting provider. So 60+% of Ethereum nodes are on centralized services. You can look at pool distribution. So look at Lido, look at the exchanges, look at Staked US, Rocket Pool. I believe Swell is a new marketplace or provider. Node clients as well. So actually having a large amount of the client on something like Geth is also a risk for the Ethereum network not being able to finalize. You can look at geographic node distribution and coin ownership distribution. So all of these things can be indicators of how decentralized a network is and how resilient and performant it will be because of that. And so you might be thinking, what can I do? Maybe you work at a protocol, maybe it's launching soon, you're thinking about how to incentivize more infrastructure providers. You definitely want to be doing that. There's a lot of compute out there looking for ways to put its resources to work, and with the right ROI, they'll be happy to do so. Support solo validators, figure out how to make it easier, educate people, make it easier. There's also distributed validator technology now, better tokenomics and crypto economic incentives. A lot of people thought, or protocols thought, inflating until infinity was the way to go, but it's not really sustainable for the infrastructure providers. Work with multiple providers and do it early and often. It's really easy to just get spin up on AWS, be the first to market, get all those vanity metrics, but it will cost you in dollars in decentralization down the road. Collaborate with partners on design and decentralize early and often. And really quickly, I just want to end with there's a lot of use cases that are driving the need for compute in this space. We have NFTs, we have the explosion of the metaverse enhanced by what Apple is doing and many Web2 companies are doing there. We have an explosion in the zero knowledge space that, Web3 Cloud, the infrastructure company I work at, is partnering with many companies today to provide application-specific hardware and new infrastructure. And then we have AI. We know that AI is almost driving a shortage in the compute market, and all of this could either lead to more centralization in infrastructure, but we can work together to keep it decentralized as well. And so, what I'm really excited about and what I hope you took away from this talk today is there's many reasons to have decentralized infrastructure networks of computational resources and data that are distributed across multiple nodes or devices rather than being concentrated in a single point or the 3 clouds. And so we believe at Web3 Cloud that decentralized software needs decentralized hardware, and through the right economic incentives, you can have a robust decentralized network supported by many infrastructure providers and not dependent just on one. And we're going to help you scale in a way that doesn't cost you billions of dollars when you're a wildly successful big protocol. Thank you very much. My name is Maggie Love. and I'm the co-founder of Web3 Cloud. I would love to talk to you if you're thinking about how to get your network incentives correct, if you're in the zero knowledge space, distributed storage space, if you're doing, sprinkling AI on top of whatever you do. And you can find me at Twitter at MaggieLove_. Have a great rest of your ETHCC.